welcome to an Everyday Canines video. We're looking at the basics of weave poles and the fundamental ways your dog performs the weave poles. There are a few things that you need to know. Probably first and the most important is that dogs always enter the weave poles on their left shoulder. So if I'm here and I'm the dog coming here, I enter on my left shoulder every single time. No matter which angle your dog is coming from, they always enter on the left shoulder. So if my dog is coming from here, they wouldn't enter like this. They would have to go around that pole and enter on the left. Always the left shoulder. I see sometimes people who are new to training and don't know this, they teach their dog to go in whichever side. But you mustn't, because that is incorrect in competition. You'd get eliminated basically, and you wouldn't, so it's not suitable for competition. So when your dog is weaving, they're always entering on the left. So their left shoulder, left front paw will be the first paw going through. However, when they get to the end on an even number of poles, which is the 6s or 12s, which is the commonest type you will see, when they get to the end, so they're weaving, as they get to this last pole, they will come out, and they are coming out in a left direction. So their right pole, their right shoulder, if you imagine, is coming past that pole. That's the last shoulder to go past the pole. So if you imagine they exit the opposite side to the one they entered. So they enter that side, they exit that side. Many judges on a course when they've got a big set of weaves and they've got fast weaving dogs, they use the exit and the entry to help judge whether the dog completed the weaves correctly. So obviously if they get the entry wrong, that's fairly obvious, but what the judge will do is if they're not sure whether a dog missed a pole along the way, they'll watch the exit, because if the dog exits correctly, they know more than likely it did all the poles correctly. If you get an odd number of poles, which you are still allowed to, so say 9, so that would be 6, 7, 8, 9. It's slightly different because the dog comes out on this side. The dog effectively has to do one more switchback before it comes out. So the dog would come out here and then it comes out here. So it's leaving on the same side it began. As I mentioned in a previous video, this can cause some dogs a lot of confusion. A lot of dogs they get muddled. It can also cause the handler some confusion if you haven't realised you've got an uneven number of weave poles and you suddenly go, oh, my dog came out on the wrong side. Because as handlers we get conditioned to knowing our dog should exit that way. And when they exit the wrong way we go, ooh, well, that was weird. So I can't say you won't see them at this stage in 2021. They are still legal to have 9 weave poles, but you'd be very unlikely to see them. So another thing to know about when your dog is doing the weaves, we want our dogs to do the weaves as smoothly and rhythmically as possible. Again, it's about strain on the body. If they do it nice and smoothly, it's not so much strain on the body. So what you usually see is they call it paddling. And that's where the dog is using its front feet, it's almost like a swimming motion, to get itself through the poles, and the back end follows. That's what we want to see, because when a dog is doing that, they're not only completing the weave poles in a smooth and speedy fashion, it's also the safest way to complete them. What we don't want to see is a situation where our dog crosses their paws. Now, my old boy Merlin used to do this, and it's slower, but it's also really complicated on the paws. He used to come to a weave pole, so imagine these are his front feet. He used to put one foot through, then he'd come with the second foot. These are his front paws. So now his legs are crossed. Now he's got to bring this leg through to do this one and bring this leg through. That was because he always wanted to lead with his right foot, and it simply, you can't, and it gets yourself all in a muddle, and it's slow, and you know, you're having to twist your legs. It's not nice. What we want our dogs to do is we want them to either be a single or a double paddle, we call it. So a single paddle is usually, you see it with bigger dogs, because they tend to have the ability to do that with their stride. It's where they have they're both front paws and they push off one side, then push off the other side. I can't do it because I'm not a dog, but you imagine they push into the weaves this way, then they lift both front paws and push that way. So they're propelling themselves through the weaves with their front paws together. They're not crossing their paws, they're working in tandem. What you tend to see with smaller dogs, again, this is variant, you know, because you see it with big dogs too, is you see a single paddle. This is where the dog only uses one foot per side. So in this instance, if I'm coming in this way, the dog leads with the right foot. This foot doesn't hit the ground because this foot is coming around to hit on the next pole. Obviously that requires a certain stride ability, otherwise the dog won't be able to get around the poles. So again, it depends on stride length, depends what the dog is comfortable with. But that's the two types of stride you want to see through weave poles. And if you don't see either of those, then you're going to say to yourself, well, that's not quite weaving correctly. It's not going to be the smoothest weave, it's not going to be the fastest weave. Now I just want to discuss quickly a couple of ways, the different ways people teach weave poles. And honestly, there are quite a few ways to teach weave poles. Of all the piece of equipment in agility, there are so many ways to teach it. That's probably the only other thing is running contacts. But I'll go through the commonest ways you will see these taught so you can understand the difference and what suits you best. So when we were first training, when I was first training, we commonly used to do a lure method, which is where we'd have a treat on the dog's nose and we'd lure them all the way through the weaves. Sometimes they'd be on a lead as well, so they couldn't go anywhere. So it'd be like this. And the dog would be following the treat and look, hey, my dog weaves. My dog does weaves. First session, my dog does weaves. You might also get some nice little fancy footwork in there. They used to call it the push me, pull me technique. So what it would be is as the dog went away from you, you pushed with your foot. As they came in, you pulled with your other foot. Push me, pull me. That was your little fancy thing. That's what we used to do. And we used to be going, hey, look, the problem with the lure method and why most people don't use it these days is the dog becomes fixated on the handler's hand motion rather than what they're actually doing. So they don't tend to be so independent with their weaves. They tend to need the handler to be with them. Certainly with my Sheltie Merlin, I taught him that way. I had to be with him. I couldn't move away from him. They get used to the footwork too, so that you cannot go off and do something. And in today's courses where you need to often be somewhere else, being stuck beside your dog is not ideal. So you won't see that method very often these days. There are still some people using it, but I would say it's not ideal. It does get the dog to weave, but you then stack up other problems. The next method you'll see, which is pretty common, and I'll just get my weave poles adjusted because my weave poles are set up to do that, is channel weaves. Channel weaves, as the name implies, are where your weave poles are set as with a channel. I've obviously moved these over so you can see the channel better. They wouldn't normally be at this angle. I just want you to see there's a channel so that the dog can go through without technically weaving. And this is how a lot of clubs train weaves. So what then happens is you'd set your dog up with the weaves, there'd be a toy there or a treat or someone with a treat. You send your dog through, it might even be bigger than this, it'd be really full length, and the dog will just run through it. It's like a corridor. And you go, great, excellent. Then as you go along, you move these in. So the channel gets narrower, and you move them in, and eventually the idea is that they are completely shut and the dog weaves. The problem I find with channels used on their own is that very often dogs get stuck at a point where you can't get the weaves any closer. You can usually get to this point where it's almost closed and then you can't get to the next level. And it can be a real nightmare to get over that last little hurdle. It's because the dog learns initially to power through the weaves. And I've mentioned this before in other behaviours. If you teach your dog to do one behaviour and then you change what you're asking of that behaviour, you're effectively teaching a brand new behaviour. So if your dog has learned that it just powers through and you don't change that up pretty quickly, then the dog gets to a point where, well, this is no longer what I do. I power through them as a channel, and now they're not a channel, I can't do them, I just pop out. So I do use channels. I use them actually with my older dogs because they're a good way of doing weaves with putting less strain on the body. So if I'm doing weave exercises with full sets of 12, I don't want my dog doing more than maybe 3 repetitions in closed weaves because it's a strain on the body and on the back and on the spine. So I will open them up. So basically they just run through them. That's fine because my dogs know how to weave. But in a learning environment, you can get stuck on channel weaves. Now my last method is called the 2x2 method. It was championed by Susan Garrett, and I have to say this is my favourite method. However, I do a hybrid version. I combine it with channels to get the complete picture, but that's another discussion. But the 2x2 method, from a beginner standpoint, it can be the hardest one to figure out because it's like you get your brain around it. For the dog, it makes an epic weaving dog. I've recently been helping a friend with her dog who had been learning on channels. He wasn't getting to the closed weaves on channels. We did about 3 weeks on 2x2s and he's now weaving 6 closed poles. So that's how fast you can get it. I highly recommend, if you're new to this, find Susan Garrett's DVD 2x2s, and that will explain so much. It's great. But basically a 2x2 is where you have just 2 poles. You can do this, I've got mine now, I've got a proper set, but you can do this with your stick in the ground, anything that breaks into 2. And how you begin is you set it up, you would actually set it up almost straight like a channel, and your dog runs through them. You're just getting the idea to start with that your dog runs through the poles. Then you start to close them. Now remembering that your dog always comes in on the left shoulder, so they're always going to be coming in this side, and remember your support's always opposite the way the dog is putting its feet. So I wouldn't ask my dog to come in this way because it would be putting its foot on that support bar. So as you go with channels, 2x2s, you start quite easy, you gradually make them straighter, 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 until you get to a point where your dog is coming into them straight. They've now learned the entry of a weave pole. That happens quite quickly over a few sessions, and then you add in another set of 2. But you start again with them twisted. So if I get another set, so I might even put them open again a little bit, but here I've got another set, but again it's straight, it's starting again. It's got that spacing to it. I can actually space mine because I've got the foot here, and then you do the exactly same, you work closer, straighter, 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 until your dog does 4. And then you add another 2 and you do 6, and so on. This method teaches the dog early on what it's got to do with its body. And so it's a really good method. And it is something that needs to be, it's a lot more complicated than what I'm just saying, but you can Google it on the internet. Recommend that DVD. I'll put a link to that in my description. But that is the method I really like with the combination channel weaves. They are your 3 basics that you'll most commonly see. There are other methods out there. There's something called V-weaves. There are other types and versions of poles, but those are the ones you'll commonly see, and those are the ones you'll probably hear people talk to you about. They say, do you want to train as channels, 2x2s, so forth. I hope that's helped answer a few questions for you about weaves and how they work. If you've enjoyed this video, you might like to check out our YouTube channel and subscribe, and you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, and I hope to see you all again very, very soon.